From Bloomberg Quick Take, I'm Madison Mills. We've just learned that White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany is the latest member of the administration to test positive for COVID-19. This comes as President Trump is receiving several treatments and medications to treat his bout of COVID-19, and that may not be a great thing for him. And joining us to discuss this and more is Bloomberg News' Drew Armstrong. Drew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, it's a pleasure.
So first, I just want to talk with you about this article you wrote up talking about the kind of drawbacks of VIP syndrome. Can you tell us what that is and how it might impact the president's treatment plan?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's going on right now is that we know that President Trump is getting a number of pretty high-powered therapies, and we don't know a whole lot about his actual medical condition just because the White House hasn't really provided a tremendous amount of detail. And so he's getting a lot of very aggressive treatment. We don't know if that treatment is actually lined up with, the need for it necessarily, or if he's being treated more aggressively because he is he is a VIP, obviously. And there is this term in medicine called VIP syndrome, where very important people who have a lot of power to push for, the best and the most medical care can sometimes get overtreated with more aggressive therapies that aren't necessarily called for. And remember, all of these things do come with potential side effects.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the antiviral cocktail that we're hearing about that Trump is receiving. What is that, and what's the efficacy of that treatment?
Well, so there's two different drugs that have a more direct impact on the virus. There is a antibody cocktail that he's getting. It's a very experimental drug made by Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. And essentially what it does is replace some of the immune systems or supplement some of the immune system's response to the virus, similar to how a vaccine would or a person who has an immune response would. He's also gotten and continues to get a drug called remdesivir, which is another experimental medicine, but that has a little bit more data behind it that actually directly attacks the virus. And then he's getting a third medicine called dexamethasone, which is a steroid that's usually used in more severe patients who have the need for oxygen support or who are on a ventilator. And it's meant to actually tone down the body's response. This is a two-part kind of illness you need to think about, where the first stage tends to be the sickness caused by the virus, and a second stage, which is really what does tend to hurt some people who enter into it, is the kind of overdrive the body's immune system goes into, and can cause a great deal of inflammation and actually cause its own types of damage. And this drug is meant to tone that down, but we don't know if Trump actually needs that or if he's just getting it at this point.
And so what can we infer about Trump's condition given the several treatments that you just described? What do we know about how those treatments can tell us the context of what he's experiencing?
With a normal patient, I would say that if you were given this list of therapies and told that the patient was on them, you would know quite a bit. With the president, I think it's a little bit harder to tell. There just has been such a total information vacuum from the White House about how sick that he actually is, with some meaningfully conflicting statements about that you don't know is he getting these treatments because they're being more aggressive for one reason or another than they would with a normal patient, or is he getting these treatments because he actually needs them? I know there's been a lot of efforts to kind of work backwards from the list of therapies that he's getting and saying, oh, it must mean he's really sick. In normal circumstances, that might be a good assumption. I don't necessarily know if it is the right assumption to make here. We just frankly don't know. I think we have to be very honest with ourselves about that.
Is it possible that the president could receive too many treatments at once and that they could cause some sort of adverse reaction?
Yeah, of course. I mean, listen, every drug, there's a saying in medicine that, it's the dose that determines whether or not something is a poison. And, when we talk about FDA review of things, they talk about benefits and risk, and not necessarily that a drug is perfectly safe and perfectly effective. It's a balance between those two things. Every drug has the potential to have some level of side effects. The side effect profile of the first two drugs doesn't appear to be particularly concerning based on the limited amount of data we have. The drug dexamethasone, the steroid that we mentioned that's used later on in more severe patients, actually has shown the potential for negative outcomes and kind of a greater trend toward death in patients that are treated on the early side, who don't need oxygen support. or ventilation. So, I mean, there are real reasons to be potentially concerned about this. He's obviously getting care from a really elite team of doctors. I mean, if anybody's going to get good care, it's going to be the president. But none of these drugs are without risks.
You mentioned if anyone's going to get good care, it's going to be the president. I'm wondering what you can tell us about kind of what the experience would be like for the average American. Would they have access realistically to something like this antiviral cocktail that you're describing?
Well, certainly the Regeneron drug, the antibody cocktail, is the right way to think about it. That's a pretty complex biotechnology drug. The only people who have had access to that, by and large, have been folks who've been in a small clinical trial so far. As far as I think we know, nobody out there has gotten the combination of drugs that the president has gotten. So in some ways, he is a little bit of a guinea pig for what's going on here, which I think is interesting, and it could be concerning to some folks in and of itself. Remdesivir, the antiviral drug by Gilead that he continues to get, that has become much more widely available. And dexamethasone, the steroid that we talked about, is a highly available generic drug that's been around for a long time and used in treatment of other diseases.
And how could Trump's treatment plan potentially impact clinical trials? Is there a possibility that folks are less likely now to sign up for a clinical trial and risk not receiving treatment?
I think that's been a concern all throughout with some of the emergency measures that have been taken to make these things available. We saw this with blood plasma, where we still don't have a great published evidence base on whether or not it actually works. And there's been such access to some of these drugs that it means that people don't sign up for clinical trials. I mean, think about it. If you're a patient and you say, hey, you could sign up for a clinical trial, maybe you'll get the drug and maybe you'll get the placebo, or you can just go ahead and get the drug and, we're your doctors and we think you should probably take it. That's a reason that some of these clinical trials for drugs across the spectrum have had a hard time enrolling, which means it's harder to get concrete evidence of whether or not they work. Certainly from a publicity standpoint and a desire for patients to get this, the president getting the drug, if he does well, is almost certainly going to increase demand for these things. It raises the profile of them. That said, as a case of one person here, it may not have a meaningful effect beyond kind of the demand side.
I want to talk about contact tracing and sort of this idea of the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation ceremony being a super spreader event. Do you know, or do we know yet, whether folks in the Trump administration who tested positive could have then gone out in the DC community and spread the virus to other folks unknowingly?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, every instance, I think the way I would think about it is that viruses need people and interactions in order to transmit. And if these folks who have, were at this Rose Garden ceremony and the events afterwards, which seem to be the nexus of spread here, then leave the White House, go out to their homes with their family members, go out to the store, essentially engage in those types of close contact that we know is what tends to be the vehicle for spread of this virus, then yeah, I mean, this is potentially a seeding event for elsewhere. That said, there is plenty of virus circulating elsewhere in the community. It's not like the White House is a vacuum. It came into the White House from outside, but it's certainly not helpful to the efforts to crack down on this to have any number of additional people out there spreading virus.
And DC Mayor Muriel Bowser mentioned that this could be technically the biggest super spreader event that DC has had. Would you agree with that assertion? And like you said, it's coming from outside of the White House. So how do you kind of contextualize that?
I think it's almost certainly the most closely watched one that's happened in DC. Everywhere around the country has had events, cases of transmission, in some cases of significant transmission. I think what we see from some of the pictures that have come out of the White House around this event is a large number of, in some cases, potentially vulnerable people not taking the types of precautions that many other Americans have been taking and have been asked to take during the course of this pandemic. And so I think, that's where the particular concern comes from here. And, you're seeing the results of that with multiple additional new positives seemingly every day. And hopefully all these people recover quickly and fully. But, you already have the president in the hospital, obviously. I mean, it's unfortunate to expose anyone to this if they don't have to be.
And do we have any update on the timeline for the president? Originally, he was hoping to get out today. What do you think that timeline is going to look like?
I think we've heard that there's going to be a decision later today. I think one of the things with these drugs that's notable is that, typically if you're a patient for just about anything, if your doctors are adding more therapies and more kind of aggressive treatments, that's not necessarily a sign that you're close to being discharged. That said, there are obviously pretty advanced medical facilities at the White House itself. And so, him moving from Walter Reed to the White House, he's still almost certainly going to be, just because he's technically discharged from the hospital, doesn't mean he's not going to be getting medical care. It doesn't mean he's not going to be surrounded by doctors and people able to take care of him and able to get more or less, almost anything he needs from the comfort of the White House.
Drew Armstrong, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you've got a lot of coverage to get to, so we will let you get back to it. But thank you for answering all these questions. And for folks watching, you can continue to follow this story on Bloomberg Quick Take wherever you get your news. Thank you so much.
Thank you.